On the night of November 6, 1992, heavy rain fell across the South Dakota plains, washing over highways and filling shallow ditches with water. Along Interstate 29, just north of Brookings, visibility was poor and the roads were slick. At 11:17 p.m., a silver Oldsmobile Cutlass pulled into a lone gas station that sat at the edge of a tree line. The security camera above the pump flickered as it captured the driver stepping out, Paul Trenton, age 39, a logistics manager returning home from a business trip in Sioux Falls. Paul was a quiet, structured man, married for 12 years, father of two, punctual to a fault. He traveled often for work and always called when he was on his way home. That night, he hadn't called. But given the storm, his wife assumed he was simply running behind. She went to bed around 11:30, expecting to see him in the morning. But Paul never arrived. The next morning, his Oldsmobile was found in the same spot where he had parked it, positioned neatly beside the pump. It had been fully fueled. The receipt from the transaction was time-stamped at 11:19 p.m. The car doors were locked. Inside were Paul's briefcase, a jacket folded across the passenger seat, and his travel mug still half full of coffee. But there was one crucial thing missing: the car keys. They were not in the ignition, not on the seat, not in the console, nowhere inside the vehicle. The gas station clerk who worked the overnight shift said he never saw Paul, though the surveillance footage proved otherwise. The camera showed Paul exiting the car, beginning to pump fuel, then stepping slightly out of frame, never to return. At 11:21, the pump stopped. The nozzle was returned to its cradle. But Paul never reappeared on camera. He was simply gone. Search teams were dispatched immediately. The surrounding woods were combed. Ditches and culverts were checked. Helicopters were brought in to scan the tree canopy. Nothing. No signs of a struggle. No footprints beyond the rain-soaked gravel. No broken branches or clothing shreds. It was as if Paul had stepped into the darkness and vanished. His wife, Karen Trenton, was devastated. She insisted he wouldn't leave voluntarily. Paul didn't have secrets, she told reporters. He was the kind of man who wrote thank you cards to hotel staff. Investigators examined every angle. Paul's financials were clean. No debts, no offshore accounts. No odd calls before his trip. The fuel receipt confirmed he paid with his own credit card. His last call was made at 10:58 p.m. from a roadside diner where he picked up coffee. That call, to his office voicemail, included a simple message: back on the road. Should be home in about an hour. But he never made it 30 miles beyond that point. The area around the gas station became a place of quiet pilgrimage for those who remembered the case. Locals would occasionally leave flowers near the pump or notes pinned to nearby trees. Some believed Paul had been abducted. Others thought he had slipped and fallen into a ditch during the storm. A few theorized he had discovered something or someone out there in the dark, but without any concrete evidence. The case grew cold. In 1994, it was archived. In 1999, the gas station was shut down. In 2006, the land was sold to a private firm and fenced off. By 2010, Paul Trenton had been missing for 18 years. Then, during an unusually wet spring, a drainage tunnel several miles from the original gas station site became severely clogged. City maintenance crews were dispatched to clear it. The tunnel, built beneath an old logging trail, had collected years of runoff, leaves, and branches. Workers lowered themselves into the wide concrete opening with floodlights and gloves, dragging debris toward the entrance. At about 20 feet in, they found something unusual. Wedged between a cluster of damp leaves and bits of rusted metal was a small object, a metallic keyring, dulled by time and coated in grit. Attached were 3 keys, a car key, a house key, and a luggage key. Hanging beside them was a flattened brass fob, etched with 2 letters, PT. The workers turned the object over to city officials, who contacted local law enforcement. Within hours, the keys were identified as belonging to Paul Trenton. The car key matched the make and year of Paul's Oldsmobile Cutlass. The house key fit the lock still installed at Karen Trenton's residence. The luggage key matched the small brass suitcase Paul used for overnight trips. The weight of the discovery hit the town like a thunderclap. After nearly 2 decades of silence, something had surfaced. The keys were found more than 6 kilometers from the gas station, in a location downhill from the highway. Investigators surmised they had been carried there by water, possibly over years of rainfall and snowmelt, or that they'd been dropped there, intentionally or not. Even more curious, several feet farther into the tunnel, wedged in a curve near the runoff grate, was a warped piece of aluminum, half covered in rust. It appeared to be part of the suitcase tag, though faded. The remains of a sticker showed a flight itinerary, water damaged but partially legible. It listed Paul's name. Suddenly, there was movement again. News stations picked up the story. The cold case file was reopened. Theories that had long faded into late-night radio returned with full force. But the one thing still missing was Paul himself, and the question no one could answer. How did his keys end up in a tunnel miles away, without a trace of him ever being there? The keyring sat inside a sealed evidence bag, resting on the table in front of Detective Mark Elridge. He had only been in college when Paul Trenton vanished in 1992, but the case had been local legend ever since. Now, with the sudden reappearance of those keys in a drainage tunnel nearly 2 decades later, the file was officially reopened and Elridge was assigned as lead. He reviewed the original reports. Paul was last seen on surveillance footage at 11:17 p.m., walking around his vehicle at the rain-soaked gas station. The pump shut off 2 minutes later. No footage showed him leaving. His car, locked and full of gas, had been found untouched the next morning. The only thing missing? The keys, now sitting in front of Elridge, tarnished and water-stained, but undeniably real. They had resurfaced in a concrete tunnel 6 kilometers away. The structure was an old runoff system built beneath a disused logging trail, funneling water from a nearby slope into the woods. It had been inspected before, in 1993, and again in 2001, but no mention of any keys or personal items appeared in those records. So the obvious question was, when did they get there? Elridge drove to the site with 2 officers. The entrance was wide enough to crouch inside, a slick concrete arch swallowed in shadows. The air smelled of damp earth and rust. Water still trickled through the tunnel, though the spring floods had receded. At the 22-foot mark, a faint yellow X had been spray-painted by the maintenance crew to indicate where the keys had been lodged. Elridge knelt and examined the area. The sediment had shifted recently, disturbed by workers clearing debris. But farther up the slope, something caught his attention, a snag of fabric trapped in a tangle of tree roots just beyond the grate. He gently tugged it free, a dark scrap, likely polyester, thin and brittle from exposure. The fragment was sent for testing. Back at the station, Elridge reviewed Paul's last known movements in greater detail. From the time he left the diner at 10:58 p.m. to when his car appeared on the gas station camera at 11:17 p.m. Nearly 20 minutes had passed. The drive should have taken no more than 12. That left a gap, 6 to 8 minutes unaccounted for. A visit to the old diner provided little. The owners had changed, and the building itself had been remodeled. But one waitress from that night, now retired and living nearby, agreed to speak. "I remember him," she said, stirring sugar into her tea. "He sat near the window, polite, quiet, tipped well." When asked if she'd seen anyone else speaking to Paul that night, she paused. There was a man in a raincoat, sat 2 booths behind him, never ordered anything, just sat there. The waitress said she didn't think much of it at the time, but now it nagged at her. There was something about the way he watched the parking lot, she added, like he was waiting for someone to leave. Elridge added the detail to the file. The original investigators hadn't mentioned a second individual. Likely, the man had left before they arrived. But then came the lab results. The fabric retrieved from the tunnel matched the lining of a windbreaker sold in the early 1990s. Specifically, a model Paul's wife confirmed he owned. The test also revealed faint traces of motor oil and iron-rich sediment, consistent with the tunnel environment. Suddenly, a new theory took shape. What if Paul had somehow left the gas station and, disoriented by the storm, ended up off the road? If he'd wandered into the trees, slipping down the embankment, he could have reached the old logging trail. The entrance to the drainage tunnel wasn't visible from the road, but it wasn't far. and in the darkness, it might have looked like shelter. But this idea still didn't explain the locked car or why the keys were nowhere to be found until 2010. Eldridge returned to the site again, this time bringing a small drone equipped with a thermal camera. He wanted to trace the interior beyond the bend, with a tunnel narrowed into a fork. The drone dipped into the darkness, its camera scanning every surface. About 50 meters in, the signal cut out. Eldridge retrieved the drone and examined the last frame it recorded. It was blurry, streaked with water droplets, but in the lower corner was something unmistakable, a partial shoe print, too degraded to trace, but too defined to be natural. Someone had been deep inside that tunnel at some point, possibly recently. He expanded the search radius. Crews returned and scoured the surrounding area. Days passed. Then, upstream near the source of the drainage, a backpack was found lodged beneath a fallen log. It was in terrible condition, ripped, waterlogged, partially buried, but inside was a cracked cassette tape and a rusted metal pen engraved with PT. It had to be Paul's. The cassette was carefully cleaned and digitized. The contents were brief, muffled, but one passage stood out. Paul's voice, distorted but recognizable, spoke through a soft crackle. "I don't know how long I've been here. I thought I'd find the road again. I thought someone would hear me." A pause. Then, "If you find this, tell them I didn't run. I just couldn't find my way back." There was no timestamp, no date, just that voice, buried for nearly 2 decades, speaking from a place no one had thought to look. Eldridge sat in silence for several minutes after the playback ended. He knew then that Paul Trenton had survived, at least for a while, long enough to record his voice, long enough to try to leave a message. The question now wasn't just what happened to him, but why no one ever found him before. Had someone known he was out there? Had someone kept it hidden? And if Paul hadn't run, who or what locked his car behind him that night? The cassette recording changed everything. Paul Trenton had not vanished without a trace. He had wandered somewhere, into woods, into rain, into a tunnel, and remained alive long enough to speak into a tape recorder to hope that someone might one day hear his voice. The sound of it was haunting, not because of fear, but because of its clarity. He sounded exhausted, resigned, but coherent. "I didn't run. I just couldn't find my way back." Detective Mark Eldridge kept those words pinned above his desk on a yellow note card. Paul had likely entered the tunnel voluntarily, seeking shelter, possibly confused in the storm. But the locked car, the missing keys, and the gap in time still didn't align. Eldridge focused on the tape itself. It was a compact cassette common in the late 80s and early 90s, but the brand was rare. Lux Audio, a short-lived German manufacturer, Paul's wife, Karen, confirmed that Paul had used a portable Lux cassette recorder during work trips to dictate notes. But Paul's recorder had never been found. With renewed urgency, the search crew returned to the woods upstream, hoping to trace the cassette's path. The drainage tunnel funneled runoff from a shallow ravine about half a mile above the tunnel entrance. It was here, near the base of a twisted oak, that a second piece of evidence surfaced. A rusted belt buckle tangled in vines. Stamped on the back were faint initials PT. Investigators widened the search. Beneath a mound of brush and years of accumulated leaves, they discovered a partial depression in the soil, a collapsed section of what had once been a sinkhole. It was small, partially filled with decaying branches and mud, but deep enough to conceal something or someone. Cadaver dogs were brought in. They alerted. No remains were recovered. Nothing definitive. But trace organic matter suggested that someone had been there long enough for scent to linger after all these years. Back at the station, Eldridge reviewed the cassette one more time. There were 2 seconds of audio just before Paul spoke, barely audible background noise. The lab enhanced the sound. A steady drip of water, distant wind, and something else. A metallic click, like a latch, followed by Paul's voice saying, "I'm beneath something. I think it used to be a bridge." That line finally triggered a memory. Eldridge dove into county records from the 1970s and found it. A wooden footbridge that once spanned the upper ravine behind the gas station, removed in 1984 after storm damage. The supports had been left in place. Over time, trees, and undergrowth reclaimed the area. But if Paul had slipped or fallen there, it would have taken him into a part of the landscape no longer documented on modern maps, a place where one could get turned around or trapped. An old survey photo showed that the bridge had once stood just 80 yards from the top of the tunnel system. Now it all made a different kind of sense. Paul had finished fueling his car. Something, or someone, drew his attention just out of frame. Perhaps he thought he saw something in the woods. Perhaps someone called out. Perhaps he recognized a sound and followed it. Either way, he stepped into the storm and headed into the trees. The tunnel had 2 entry points, both accessible from that direction. But if he entered from above, seeking shelter, and moved downward through the tunnel system, it's possible he dropped or lost his keys somewhere along the way. The heavy rainfall might have flushed him through the channel, out of reach, unable to climb back. Perhaps injured, Paul may have spent hours, days, trying to find another way out. But the truly chilling part came from Karen. When shown the recovered tape and allowed to listen to a portion of it, she broke down, not from sorrow, but from recognition. "I remember that tape recorder," she said. Paul used to keep a fresh one in the side pouch of his briefcase. But his briefcase had been found locked in the car. The tape recorder was never found. Nor was the second key to the car, which Paul always kept clipped inside that pouch, which raised a deeply troubling question. How had the car been locked from the outside? Karen herself had told police in 1992 that both car keys were missing, yet only one was accounted for on the recovered keyring. The second remained gone, and someone had reholstered the gas nozzle after Paul vanished. Security footage never showed anyone else, but visibility that night had been poor. The camera was black and white grainy and pointed at only one angle. Elridge requested a digital enhancement from the state lab. 2 days later, the results arrived. In the 2 minutes between Paul stepping off camera and the fuel nozzle being returned to its cradle, there was a brief flicker motion in the upper right corner of the frame. A shadow, tall, narrow, passing between pumps. Just for a second, it did not match Paul's shape or size. The angle suggested the person was coming from behind the station, not from the direction of Paul's car. Whoever it was, they never looked up, never turned toward the camera, and never appeared again. This detail opened a floodgate of theories. Had Paul been followed? Was someone else already at the station that night? Had he stepped away, thinking he saw something, someone in trouble? Or worse, was he lured? Karen, devastated but composed, returned to the station one final time. She brought with her something small, an old journal Paul kept, mostly empty, but with one torn page still intact. It read, "If I ever get caught in one of those storms again, I'll probably just pull over and wait. No use fighting it. Storms are patient. You have to wait with them." Now, nearly 2 decades later, that's exactly what he had done. Pulled over, waited, and was never seen again. The discovery of the keys, the tape, the buckle, and the journal scraps created a ghost map, pieces of a path that Paul had walked in his final hours. And even though no remains were ever found, his voice had returned. He had spoken, and now someone was listening. By late autumn of 2010, the case of Paul Trenton was no longer just a local curiosity. It had become a haunting mystery with new pieces clicking slowly into place. For Detective Mark Elridge, each fragment, the keys and the tunnel, the cassette tape, the scrap of jacket, and the partial footprint, told a silent story. But the final shape of that story was still shrouded in rain, mud, and silence. What haunted Elridge most was not the suggestion of foul play, but the possibility of deep, unintentional solitude. The idea that Paul, a man known for being prepared, meticulous, and deliberate, had stepped into a moment of confusion and never found his way out, and that somewhere in those woods, his final days had passed without witness. But then came something unexpected. An archivist from the South Dakota Department of Transportation contacted Elridge with a small stack of microfiche scans. During a routine digitization of old construction records, a report from the early 90s had surfaced, dated February of 1993, just 3 months after Paul's disappearance. The report described a routine inspection of an abandoned access tunnel under a gravel service road near the same drainage system where Paul's keys had been found. The maintenance crew had entered to investigate a suspected blockage caused by frozen water. What they found instead was a stack of objects just inside the entryway: a water-damaged briefcase, a broken umbrella, and a thermos. Its cap cracked, but still sealed. The foreman at the time made a handwritten note. Items appear placed intentionally. Tunnel floor dry. No sign of owner. No need for further inspection. No attempt was made to connect these objects to any open cases, and the items were never logged into evidence. Elridge read the report twice. The briefcase matched the description of Paul's. One Karen, I believe, was left in the car, but the report noted a small, rectangular indentation inside the outer pocket, the exact shape of the Lux cassette recorder Paul had used, a shape absent from the briefcase found in the Oldsmobile. The implications were chilling. Had Paul returned to his car that night? Had he unlocked it, retrieved a recorder, and locked it again? If so, how? Was he accompanied? And if he had made it back to the vehicle after his detour into the woods, why hadn't he stayed? Elridge returned to the site again, this time with full access to the tunnel described in the 1993 report. It was narrow, curved, and terminated in a sealed maintenance hatch that hadn't been opened in nearly 30 years. With permission, the hatch was forced open. Behind was a chamber no larger than a garden shed, damp, silent, coated in dust and mineral buildup. And in the corner, nestled into the concrete, was the final piece of the puzzle: a pair of shoes. Size 10, scuffed, faded, still laced. Next to them, an empty thermos cap, and the crumpled remains of a grocery bag bearing the faded logo of a Sioux Falls store. The bag contained a receipt dated November 6, 1992, 9:48 p.m. It listed a sandwich, a pack of AA batteries, and a disposable rain poncho. Paul had purchased them all less than 2 hours before vanishing. Elridge stared at the items for a long time. It didn't make sense. If Paul had been alone in the woods, how had these items ended up sealed behind a hatch never reopened? The only explanation: Paul had moved to the tunnel network, willingly or otherwise, seeking safety or maybe just light. But there was one last item. Tucked in the sandwich wrapper was a folded note, the ink blurred and fragile, but legible in parts. I waited. The lights never came. The tunnel bends, but doesn't end. I'm close, but I can't find the door again. There was no name, no date, but the writing matched samples from Paul's travel notebooks. For Elridge, the note felt like a final breath. Paul had lived long enough to recognize he was trapped, to know he was no longer where he had intended to be. The door may have been literal, a hatch, a grate, an exit, or it may have been metaphorical. Hope fading with time. Back in Brookings, the discoveries were delivered gently to Paul's family. Karen chose not to view the items in person, but she requested photographs. She said she wanted to remember Paul as he had been: calm, dependable, quietly curious. At a small ceremony in December that year, Paul's keys were placed in a shadow box beside a copy of the cassette tape. The display now sits in the Brookings Historical Society, with a simple brass plaque that reads, "He didn't vanish. He wandered, and the storm forgot to let him go." Some questions, however, still remained. Why was Paul drawn off course that night? What made him step away from his car mid-rainstorm, leaving no sign of distress? And more mysteriously, who had returned the gas pump to its cradle? No one could answer that. But months later, Elridge received one more letter. It came anonymously, addressed in careful block letters, postmarked from a small town 90 miles away. Inside was a single page. It read, "He wasn't supposed to go into the woods. I didn't think he saw me. I just needed a ride. I was cold. I was scared. He followed something he thought was real. He shouldn't have followed, but he did, and then it was too late." No signature. The paper carried no fingerprints. But it was something. A confession? A witness statement? A plea? Elridge placed in the file and marked the case with a single word: incomplete. Paul Trenton's voice, captured on that brocassette, is now preserved in digital form, filed as part of a cold case that remains technically unsolved, but no longer without shape. He had spoken. He had left pieces behind. And those pieces had spoken back. And for the first time in 18 years, someone had answered. Winter in South Dakota crept in slowly, settling over the fields and roads with a stillness that seemed almost respectful. As the wind softened and the final search efforts drew to a close, Detective Mark Elridge found himself returning one last time to the place where it had all begun, the now abandoned gas station off Interstate 29. It had been shuttered for over a decade, the pumps rusted in place, the overhead lights long gone. But the memory of that November night in 1992 still hung in the air like a question that had learned to whisper. Paul Trenton had stopped here. He had fueled his car. And then, without warning or witness, he had stepped out of sight, leaving behind a car with locked doors, a sealed briefcase, and no keys. Now, after nearly 2 decades, the pieces of his final hours had emerged. The Kearing Lodge in a drainage tunnel, the rusted suitcase tag, the cassette tape buried with waterlogged fragment of a life lived carefully, the tunnel chamber, the note in the sandwich wrapper, the shoes sealed behind a forgotten hatch, and the anonymous letter. Elridge had run the handwriting against every known database. No match. The paper type was common, the envelope generic. The postmark was from a town that had no surveillance, no mailing kiosk, no signature required. Whoever had sent it had planned for silence. But the words felt real. He followed something he thought was real. Elridge had played that line over and over in his head. In the darkness and confusion of the storm, Paul may have seen a figure, or something he interpreted as one. Maybe a person in need. Maybe movement in the trees. Maybe a signal. That was Paul. He would have stopped. He would have checked. He was the kind of man who returned dropped wallets and waited patiently when animals crossed the road. But whatever he saw, it led him off the path, off the map. The tunnel system, it turned out, had not been fully mapped in decades. New blueprints had ignored the older paths. A retired city engineer, contacted late in the investigation, revealed that several auxiliary branches had once existed, used for water redirection before the modern system was installed. Most were sealed. A few remained partially accessible, hidden in overgrowth, disguised by time. Paul may have found one of those branches, or been led to it. By the time he realized there was no way back, it was too late. The recovered audio recording had been played publicly only once, during a community memorial held on the 20th anniversary of his disappearance. Karen Trenton chose a location, a small auditorium near the library, where Paul had once given talks on logistics and transportation safety. The tape played as people sat in silence. The static, the clicks, and then Paul's voice. I didn't run. I just couldn't find my way back. There was no explanation, no clean conclusion. But in his words, there was clarity. Paul hadn't disappeared in anger. He hadn't left his life behind. He had fought to stay in it long after most would have stopped trying. At the request of the family, the case was marked closed without recovery. Not solved, not dismissed, just closed. Because, in many ways, Paul had done that himself. He had told them, in his own voice, that he had tried, that he hadn't meant to leave, that it wasn't his choice. Weeks later, a volunteer who had assisted in the searches returned to the site one final time. She walked the same path through the trees behind the old gas station. The leaves had fallen. The air was sharp and clear. She reached the spot near the footbridge, now nothing more than rotting posts swallowed by weeds, and sat on a nearby rock. She stayed there for nearly an hour, listening to the wind pass through the dry reeds and over the concrete lip of the drainage tunnel. And then, just once, she heard it, a quiet clink, like keys against metal. She turned, but saw nothing. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe it was nothing. But maybe not. Today, Paul's belongings are preserved in a museum archive under the collection title, Trenton, Paul, Objects Retrieved from Time. The cassette tape remains private, with a copy stored digitally in the family possession. The Kearing, placed behind glass, is now a quiet centerpiece in the town's historical room. Visitors often ask about it, and those who remember 1992 share the story softly, carefully, not as a tragedy, but as a reminder that even the most predictable life can brush against the strange, that the quietest people sometimes leave behind the loudest echoes, and that sometimes in the places we least expect, between the trees, under the roads, inside the forgotten tunnels. There are stories waiting to be heard, not lost, just waiting, like keys caught in a current, carried through darkness, until someone looks down and notices a shine.